After you're done drawing your owl, you're going to want to draw something for your owl to sit upon. For me, I'm drawing a branch and I'm making sure that I'm not getting too curvy or too rigid with my strokes. I'm using loose, straight lined strokes to create the illusion of a kind of branch that has knobs and edges to it. But if I go too curvy, then that branch is going to look like a rubber stick. And if I go too straight, the branch is going to look fake and outlined. So I'm challenging you to do loose, straight line strokes, kind of like a painterly fashion, and be super, super, super loosey goosey with it. That's how you're going to get those natural bends in your stick, but your stick is going to not look like a piece of rubber if you stick with the straight line construction kind of setup here. So I'm not really necessarily outlining this. I'm just randomly adding branches here and there because like a branch doesn't really follow a specific direction. You got different growths in different areas. So when you make your branches, take that into consideration um, before moving forward. So now that we have our owl's body established, let's start working on the tree limb itself. After you've mapped out the tree limb using straight line construction, we are going to use a broken line shading technique to create the texture of tree bark. So in order to do this, you're going to space out your lines and you're going to go in at a side diagonal hatch, but you're not going to necessarily do like an even texture here. You're just going to kind of feather your way through. Remember, this is your first layer, so don't go too dark too quickly. Allow some space in between your lines. And if you have to, work with the middle, having your fingers at the middle of your pen instead of the very tip of your pen, have them in the middle of your pen. This will help give you more control when it comes to your pressure. So we're going to move all the way across our tree before we start adding a variety of shadow. We're just going to block in layer number one here before diving into any more details. Now that we've established our first layer of shadow, let's play with the underside of our branch. So let's say our light's coming from the top and we have a shadow on the underside. So using the same pressure, but we're going to add an additional layer, and we are going to just chisel our way to the bottom of the tree. So we're doing this to kind of eyeball to see how dark we should go. We don't want to go too dark too quickly. And I am also kind of adding some crispness to the top of my branch to kind of give it a solid color there because we are going to be erasing our pencil line in the future. So we're going to repeat this underside kind of formula to the rest of our tree branch. So wherever there's an underside, we're going to add a very thin layer of secondary shadow. This is going to make your tree look more three-dimensional. It's going to make it pop more, and it's also going to make it look like it's more centered within the space of your drawing. So if you have sticks or limbs that are crossing over each other, you might want to consider doing an even like a third layer just in those areas because we would call that a double shadow. But I don't really have very many of those, so you won't really be seeing me do too much of that. But limb that goes furthest away from the light source is going to get a darker value. And there are going to be some lighter shades to your branches when they're getting closer to the top or closer to the sunlight. So just keep that in mind. Vary your pressure in those instances. Once you're done adding your shadow, feel free to add your knobs at the end of your tree limbs. See, they're like little circles. Kind of gives them more of a stick-like feel. Yeah. And I am going to kind of extend my secondary shadow on the edge here. That way I can add a really thin, crisp outer line to the bottom of my tree limb. This is my darkest dark for my tree limb. Then I'm going to have two layers of shade and then one layer of shade. It's kind of like a layered cake, so to speak. This is going to create a gradual shift in value from light to dark. You're going to see some areas where your tree limbs aren't necessarily going to look really crisp. It's going to be hard to identify that they have an edge. In those cases, just feather in those edges. See how I'm working all the way around my piece? I'm not staying on one specific area. Yeah, that's gonna help you a lot in this case. It's gonna prevent you from overworking an area. And if you do it right, your tree limb should pop out and look realistic. See, this one needs a little more crisping up, doesn't it? It's really hard to tell where the edge is. And that, my friend, is how to draw a realistic tree limb using layers of shadow. Whew, we are almost there. Now that we got our tree limb and our owl, it is now time to add our background. You get to choose what background you decide to have. I'm going to do a series of hills using some light curved sketches and maybe a circular shape for my moon or my sun. Probably my moon, but I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm not going to go too crazy with my background here. I'll maybe have one cloud using a few organic, curvy, bumpy shapes to kind of block that baby into the background. Other than that, I'm going to try to keep it simple. I want all of my focus to be mostly on my owl. So, once I've established my background, I'm going to, since I'm using some hills, I'm going to feather in the outline of my hill using ink, and then I'm going to use kind of a slightly curved diagonal, what do you call it, uh, hatch. I'm going to kind of move my pen in the direction and have it nice long flowing strokes to kind of mimic the way that the hill itself moves. You notice I'm kind of varying my line here. You can see some of my lines have dots of ink on the end of them. That's what I mean by when ink gathers in a certain area. That's why it's so important to vary your lines when dealing with gel-like pens, because if not, the pen will gather or pool at the end of your stroke. So just keep that in mind if you're working with kind of like a pilot pen, such as myself. Now, if you have two hills like I do, then use directional line to help separate the two and make them appear as if they're two different entities or two different hillsides. So I'm going to go in a different stroke for my first hill than I am for my second hill. I might even add a secondary layer like I am right now to my first hill to help the two separate even more. Totally optional, totally up to you. Not necessarily mandatory, but it does help give a sense of separation between the two shapes. Now it's time to work on my cloud. So I'm gonna kind of use a little bit of a curve or like a little tiny little sea lines on the underside of my cloud to kind of add that sense of three-dimensional shape. This is the undershadow, and I'm gonna go super light. You see how I don't have all of my fingers on my pen and I'm working from the middle or the higher end of my pen. It looks like I'm gonna probably have to do the same on the top here to kind of help establish that there is a cloud-like shape in the sky. And then I might have to go back and add a secondary layer on the underside of my cloud to kind of help differentiate the shades. But I'm not sure if I'm going to do that yet, so we'll see. After establishing my cloud, I'm going to feather in my moon. I've decided to do a moon. And I'm going to leave lots of white space between my lines to kind of ensure that I'm using a really light shade here. Because I don't want to go too dark too quickly, but I do want to separate it from the sky. So I might even add a secondary layer of shade in some areas to kind of get like the craters or the kind of divots in the moon itself. And then I will go over my piece and see if there's any fine-tune edges that I need to feather in to make my owl complete.